They sent him a bride meant to destroy everything. She made his ranch the richest in Texas. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a feed invoice and a water assessment notice that Elias Cutter had been dreading for 3 weeks. He stood at the end of his porch, dust still on his boots from the morning ride, and read it twice. The handwriting was careful and even, the kind that suggested someone who had learned to write from a strict teacher and never quite shook the habit of precision. The woman's name was Marguerite Solis. She was 26 years old, she said, the daughter of a merchant family in San Antonio, and she had been told by a mutual acquaintance that Elias was a serious man looking for a serious arrangement. He was 41. The last 10 years had been spent fighting for water, losing cattle to drought, and watching the 3 ranches to his north slowly close in around him like fingers forming a fist. He was not looking for a wife. He was looking for rain. But he read the letter a 3rd time, folded it carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of his work coat, where it stayed for 4 days before he wrote back. The land Elias worked had been in his family since 1861, when his father, a quiet and stubborn man named George Cutter, paid a surveyor $17 to mark the boundaries of 4,000 acres of pale grass and red dirt south of Abilene. George built the first structure on the property with creek lumber and borrowed nails, a low bunkhouse that sat too close to the ground and flooded every time the spring rains came heavy. Elias had grown up sleeping in that bunkhouse, listening to water move under the floorboards. He rebuilt it when he was 24, raised it 18 inches off the ground, and felt for the first time that the land was truly his. By 1884, the bunkhouse had become a proper house with 4 rooms and a covered porch that caught the evening wind from the west. The cattle operation was sound. He ran 1,200 head on good rotation, employed 6 men year-round and another 4 during calving season, and had never once missed a payment on anything he owed. What he could not fix, no matter how careful he was the water. The Brazos tributary that cut through the southeastern corner of his land was, according to the 1876 survey, legally his to use. He had the paper that said so. He had read it many times, but 3 neighboring ranchers, Owen Gale, Preston Marsh, and a quiet, dangerous man named Clifford Harlow, had been running an upstream diversion since 1877 that slowly, methodically reduced the flow reaching the Cutter land. Not enough to take him to court over in any single season. Just enough, year by year, to make the difference between a ranch that could withstand a dry summer and one that could not. All 3 men were backed by a land acquisition syndicate operating out of Fort Worth. The syndicate had no name that appeared on any public document. Its purpose, as far as Elias had been able to understand it, was to identify solvent but water-stressed operations in the western counties, apply financial and logistical pressure over a period of years, and then purchase the land cheaply when the owner finally broke. It was patient work. It required no dramatic confrontation, no obvious wrongdoing. It required only the willingness to wait while someone else suffered. The syndicate's man in the field was a lawyer named Gerald Aldridge. He was well-dressed, mild-mannered, and had the kind of smile that arrived slightly before it was needed and stayed slightly after it should have left. Elias had met him twice. The first time, Aldridge had come to discuss an easement offer that Elias refused immediately. The second time, 6 months later, Aldridge had come again with a revised version of the same offer dressed in different language, which Elias also refused. He kept a copy of both documents in the deed box in his study, not because he expected to need them, but because his father had taught him to keep everything. What Elias did not know, as he sat at his kitchen table composing a second letter to Marguerite Solis in the autumn of 1884, was that Gerald Aldridge had found her 3 months earlier. The meeting had taken place in a small office above a dry goods store in San Antonio. Aldridge had arrived with 2 things: a full accounting of the Solis family debt, which was significant and had been quietly purchased by the syndicate from the original creditors, and a proposal that he presented in the tone of a man offering a favor rather than making a demand. Marguerite's father, Hector Solis, had died the previous year, leaving behind a trading business that had been quietly failing for a decade, a house with a lien against it, and debts owed to 4 separate parties. Marguerite was the eldest of 3 children, the only one old enough to understand the full shape of the problem. Aldridge explained what he wanted. She would be introduced to Elias Cutter through a reliable intermediary. She would present herself as a woman of modest but respectable background seeking a practical marriage arrangement, which was not far from the truth. She would establish herself in the household, earn the man's trust, and when the moment was right, obtain access to his deed box and provide Aldridge with a signed copy of the water rights document and the original 1876 survey. With those 2 items, the syndicate's lawyers could mount a legal challenge to Elias' water claims that would be difficult and expensive to fight, far more so than anything they could attempt from the outside. In exchange, the family debt would be erased, all of it completely, without condition. Marguerite asked Aldridge how he had found her. He said only that he made it his business to know the situations of people who might be useful. She asked him what would happen to the ranch and the people on it if she succeeded. He said that was not her concern. She looked at him for a long moment, then said she would think about it. She thought about it for 11 days. The debt was not abstract. It was the kind of weight that pressed on every hour of every day, the kind that woke you in the early morning and sat with you until the sun came up. Her younger brother was 17 and needed schooling. Her sister was 14. The house they were living in could be taken from them at any time. Marguerite had no income, no clear prospect of one, and options that were narrowing with each passing month. She sent Aldridge a note that said simply, "I will do it." She said yes, and then she started watching. Marguerite had grown up in a household where watching was survival. Her father had been a kind and optimistic man who trusted people he should not have trusted, and she had spent her childhood observing the consequences of that trust and learning, quietly, to gather information before she committed herself to anything. It was not a skill she had cultivated deliberately. It was simply what happened when you paid close attention for long enough. She read every letter Aldridge sent her. She reread them. She noticed the things he did not say as carefully as the things he did. He told her what to look for in the deed box. He told her which documents to copy. He did not tell her anything about the legal basis for the challenge he planned to mount, because men like Aldridge did not explain their reasoning to the people they used as instruments. That omission she filed away. It would matter later. The journey to the Cutter Ranch took 2 days by rail and stage. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in October, when the light in that part of Texas came in at a low angle and turned the pale grass the color of old honey. The stage stopped at the end of a long dirt track and the driver pointed. She walked the last quarter mile with her bag, which was not heavy because she had not brought much. Elias was standing on the porch when she arrived. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of face that looked as if it had been left out in the weather for many years and had settled into its final form. He greeted her with formal courtesy and no warmth, which she found more reassuring than warmth would have been. Warm men who greeted strangers effusively were usually performing something. This man was simply being careful. He showed her the house. It was clean and functional and had the quality of a place where a person lived seriously, without much attention to anything that was not necessary. There were books on a shelf in the study, a mixture of practical and unexpected, a cattle breeding manual, a volume of Texan land law, 2 novels, and a Spanish grammar that had clearly been used. She noticed the Spanish grammar and said nothing. That first evening, they ate supper at opposite ends of a table that was too long for 2 people, and talked with the careful politeness of 2 individuals who understood they were beginning a negotiation. She asked him about the land. He answered in specifics: acreage, water sources, head count, rotation schedules, the kind of detail that told her he was not performing competence but actually had it. She asked about the men who worked for him. He talked about them with the easy directness of a man who had spent years alongside people and understood what each of them was good at. He did not talk about himself. She watched all of it. Over the weeks that followed, she established herself in the house and in the rhythms of the ranch. She cooked well, which was practical. She learned the names of the 6 men who worked the land year-round, most of them from families with deep roots in that part of the country, some of them with kin she recognized from San Antonio. She helped with calving records in the cold months. She organized the supply ledgers, which had been maintained accurately but without any system, and the organization of them revealed several small efficiencies that saved money without anyone having to be told to do anything differently. Elias noticed. He said nothing directly, but she caught him looking at the reorganized ledger one evening with an expression she could not fully read. She was good at this. That was the problem she had not anticipated. She was good at being exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing, and the ranch was responding to her presence the way a neglected but fundamentally sound thing responds when someone finally pays it the right kind of attention. She had not expected to care about any of it. The deed box sat in the study on the second shelf of the bookcase, unlocked. She had located it in her first week. She had not opened it. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but that was not quite true, and she knew it. She was waiting for herself to become the kind of person who could open it, and that person was not arriving. What arrived instead, on a cold morning in late November, was Owen Gale's fence crew, stringing new wire along the northern boundary in a line that crept 12 feet over the property mark that Elias' father had paid a surveyor to establish in 1861. Elias rode out to meet them. The conversation, which she watched from the ridge where she had gone to gather firewood, lasted less than 10 minutes. Gale's crew did not move the wire. Elias came back to the house with a controlled expression that told her he was much angrier than he would allow himself to show. That evening he said nothing about the wire. She said nothing about it either, but she went to the study after supper, found the copy of Gerald Aldridge's original easement offer in the deed box, and sat down at the desk to read it. Not to copy it, to read it. She read it the way the Franciscan sisters who had educated her in Mexico City had taught her to read difficult documents, slowly, with a pencil, marking every term that shifted meaning depending on how it was defined, and every clause that assumed facts not in evidence. It was the kind of reading that required patience and a good memory for the way legal language worked, which she had because her father had made her sit through enough business negotiations to understand that the most important words in any contract were usually the ones that sounded the most ordinary. By midnight, she had marked 11 passages. By 1 in the morning, she understood what Aldridge was planning. The fraud was not complicated. It was so straightforward that she was briefly surprised by it, and then she was not surprised at all, because simple fraud requires only the belief that the person being deceived is not looking. The easement language contained a clause, buried in the 3rd page, that referenced the water rights using a definition of riparian access that contradicted the language in the 1876 survey by a margin of roughly 40 yards along the tributary boundary. 40 yards was nothing. 40 yards was the distance from the porch to the water trough. But 40 yards in the right location, along the right boundary, meant that the legal claim to the tributary access point could be disputed. And if it could be disputed, then Aldridge's clients could tie it up in court long enough, and expensively enough, to accomplish exactly what 7 years of slow water restriction had not quite managed. Marguerite put the pencil down. She sat in the quiet of the study for a long time. Outside, the November wind moved through the grass with a sound like distant water. She thought about the debt. She thought about her brother's schooling and her sister's future, and the house in San Antonio with the lien against it. She thought about Aldridge's mild smile, and the casual way he had handed her a plan that assumed she would carry it out because she had no other choice. She picked up the pencil and began writing in the margin of the document, not copying it, annotating it, cross-referencing each of the 11 flagged passages against the specific provisions of Texas water law she had found in the volume on Elia's shelf, which she had been reading quietly for the past 6 weeks. She worked until 3 in the morning. Then she put the document back in the deed box, went upstairs, and lay in the dark thinking about what she was going to do next. Not what Aldridge had sent her here to do, what she was actually going to do. She had made her decision, though she did not yet know it. She would only recognize it later, when she looked back at that night and understood that somewhere between the 11th flagged passage and the first margin annotation, she had stopped being an instrument and started being a person with a plan of her own. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and dry. The tanks on the eastern quarter dropped by a third in January, and by February, the conversation among the ranch hands was quiet and careful in the way that men talk about a problem they can see coming and cannot stop. Elias rode the property every morning and came back each evening with less expression on his face than the morning before, which was, she had learned, how he registered increasing concern. He did not complain. He did not speculate about disaster. He looked at the numbers in the supply ledger, adjusted what could be adjusted, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Marguerite watched the water situation with a different kind of attention. She was looking at it as a problem that had a solution somewhere, the way her father used to look at a blocked trade route, not as a permanent obstacle, but as a fact that had causes and therefore had remedies, if you could find where the causes were located. She had begun talking to the ranch hands in the evenings, not interrogating them, just talking, the way she had learned to talk to people in the market districts of San Antonio, with genuine curiosity and no obvious agenda. The man she talked to most was Fortunato Vega, the oldest hand on the property, who had worked cattle from Chihuahua to the Llano Estacado, and had the kind of quiet authority that comes not from position, but from the simple fact of knowing more than anyone else in the room. He was 53 years old and had arrived at the Cutter Ranch 7 years earlier, following a complicated series of events he summarized as simply as possible when asked. Things went wrong farther south, and this was a good place. Elias paid him the same wage as the younger men and gave him no special title, but when there was a decision to make about cattle health or pasture rotation, everyone waited to hear what Fortunato said before they said anything. She asked him, on a cold February evening when they were both working near the eastern fence line, whether he had ever seen water in the dry creek beds that ran across the ranch's eastern quarter. The 2 beds had been dry as far back as anyone on the property could remember. The survey records noted them as seasonal and unreliable. Fortunato looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a person deciding whether a question is worth answering honestly. Then he crouched down, picked up a handful of the pale dirt, and rubbed it between his fingers. He said that, when he was younger, working country like this in Chihuahua, the old men there had a way of reading the ground, looking at the vegetation, the depth of the grass roots, the way certain plants clustered in places that seemed to have no obvious reason for their clustering. He said that the Eastern Creek bed, the longer one, had never felt dead to him. It had felt waiting. She asked him what he would do if he were trying to find out whether there was water underneath it. He told her. It would require digging, he said, and the kind of patience that most people found difficult to sustain when there was no guarantee of a result. He said it would need to go down at least 10 or 12 feet before you would know anything useful. He said that the men would think it was a waste of time and would grumble. He said that he had seen this kind of digging prove wrong twice and prove right 4 times, in country that looked a good deal more hopeless than this one. She thanked him. He nodded and went back to work without another word. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with the survey records she had quietly pulled from the deed box 2 days earlier and read the section that covered the eastern quarter. The 1876 surveyor had noted both dry creek beds in passing, marking them as intermittent channels with no reliable yield. In the margin, in a different hand, someone had written a single word and then stopped. Possible. The word had a faint line drawn under it, as if the writer had thought about adding something and then decided against it. She did not know who had written it. She did not need to know. She just needed to know if it was true. She presented the idea to Elias on a Sunday morning when the practical pressure of the week had eased enough that he could sit with a cup of coffee and think rather than react. She brought the survey record and set it on the table in front of him. She pointed to the Eastern Creek bed, described what Fortunato had told her, and explained what she was proposing. A series of test digs along the longer bed, spaced at intervals, looking for the shallow aquifer that the survey note suggested might exist. Elias read the margin note. He looked at the survey language. He was quiet for a long time. She had learned by then that his silences were not emptiness but computation, and that interrupting them was counterproductive. He said, finally, that it would take 3 men off productive work for at least 2 weeks and possibly longer. He said there was no guarantee of anything. He said the eastern quarter was the hardest ground on the property and digging in it was unpleasant work. He said all of this in a flat, informational tone. Then he said, "I will ask Fortunato." Fortunato's answer was that the ground was worth asking, which was the closest he came to enthusiasm about anything. Elias authorized the dig the following Monday morning. The first 2 locations came up dry. The third, 12 feet down at a point roughly 60 yards east of the old channel, hit wet clay that darkened and softened as they went deeper, and by the end of the second day was seeping water slowly but steadily. By the end of the third day it was yielding enough to measure. Fortunato climbed out of the hole, looked at Marguerite, and said nothing, but the expression on his face was as close to vindicated as she had ever seen on a person. They found 2 more sites within the week. The second aquifer location yielded more than the first. The third, farther east along the channel, turned out to be the strongest of the 3, and would eventually feed a stock tank large enough to service 2 full pasture rotations through a dry summer without difficulty. Elias did not say much when it became clear what they had found. He walked the 3 sites on a cold March morning, crouching at each one, touching the ground, looking up at the sky, and then at the surrounding landscape as if he were recalculating something he had previously believed was settled. He asked Fortunato 3 technical questions about depth and yield and seasonal behavior. He listened to the answers. Then he stood up and looked at Marguerite. He said, "How did you know to look here?" She told him. She had read the survey record carefully, noticed the margin note, talked to Fortunato, and asked the right question. That was all. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said that most people who read that survey record had been looking at it for 8 years and had not noticed the margin note. She said that was probably because most people looking at it already thought they knew what it said, and if you thought you already knew what a document said, you stopped reading it and started confirming it. He nodded once. Then he went to find his men and start planning the well casings. During the weeks of the dig, she had also been doing a different kind of work, quieter and slower and more difficult to describe. She had written a letter to a man in Austin named Percy Drummond, whom she knew through her father's old trade contacts as someone who had spent 30 years working land disputes across 3 counties and had the distinction, rare in that world, of not being available for purchase at any price. She had framed the letter as a general inquiry about water rights law in the Texas western counties. She asked specific questions. She did not mention Elias' name or the ranch's location. She signed it with her maiden name and gave the town of Abilene as a return address. Drummond wrote back in 6 days with a 2-page letter that was dense, specific, and exactly as useful as she had hoped. He confirmed what she had suspected from her reading, that the definition of riparian access used in Aldridge's easement document was not standard Texas legal language, but a variation of it, created specifically to conflict with the 1876 survey language, and that this conflict had, in at least 2 previous cases in adjacent counties, been used successfully by land syndicates to challenge existing water rights in court. He named the 2 cases. He named the syndicate attorneys who had argued them. He named the judge who had ruled in the syndicate's favor in one case, and, significantly, the judge who had ruled against them in the other. The judge who had ruled against them was still sitting. His name was Walter Breen, and he held court in Abilene. She read that name twice, then folded the letter carefully and put it in the pocket of her work coat. She wrote back to Drummond the following morning and asked one more question: whether he knew of a state official with both the authority and the inclination to investigate systematic fraudulent survey practices across multiple counties. She told him, this time, that she was not asking hypothetically. His reply came back in 8 days. It was shorter than the first letter. It contained one name, one title, and one sentence of personal assessment. He is the right man, and he has been waiting for exactly this kind of case. While all of this was taking place, spring was coming. The grass was greening on the southern pastures. The new wells were being cased and lined. The cattle that had gone through a difficult winter were beginning to recover their condition. The ranch, which had felt, for most of the time she had been there, like something bracing against an incoming storm, was beginning to feel like something that might hold. It was on a warm April evening, with the light going orange over the western hills and the supper things cleared from the table, that she decided the time had come. She could not have explained exactly why that evening and not another. It was simply that she had gathered everything she needed and had run out of reasons to wait, and she was tired of carrying what she was carrying alone. She asked Elias to sit with her at the kitchen table. He looked at her with mild curiosity and sat down. She put the annotated copy of Aldridge's easement document on the table between them. She put Percy Drummond's 2 letters beside it. She folded her hands on the table and told him everything, from the beginning, without leaving anything out and without softening any part of it. The room was very quiet while she talked. He did not interrupt her. He did not move. He sat with both hands on the table and watched her face with a steadiness that she found, in some way she could not name, harder to bear than anger would have been. When she finished, she waited. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then he said, quietly and without heat, "You came here to help them take my land." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you are telling me this now?" She said, "Yes." He said nothing else for what felt like a very long time. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, a soft sound of hooves on dry ground. The lamp on the table gave off a steady yellow light. Then he reached out and picked up Percy Drummond's first letter and began to read it. She watched him read. His face told her nothing. He read both letters and then read the annotated easement document, pausing at each of her margin notes and reading them carefully. He was thorough. He always was. When he had finished, he set everything down in a neat pile and looked at her again. He said, "The man in Austin, Drummond. You trust his reading of this?" She said, "I do." He said, "And the judge, Breen. You believe he cannot be reached by these people?" She said, "Drummond believes it, and I trust Drummond's judgment on that." He nodded. He was quiet again. She did not try to fill the silence. Finally he said, "Who else knows what you came here to do?" She said, "Only Aldridge and whoever gave him his instructions." He asked, "Do they know you have not done it?" She said, "Not yet." He looked at the documents one more time. Then he said that he needed to think and that she should go to bed and that they would speak again in the morning. His voice was entirely even. She could not read it at all. She went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and thought about what she had done, and whether it would be enough, and whether enough was even the right word for the situation she had placed herself in. In the morning, Elias was already at the kitchen table when she came down. The documents were stacked in front of him as she had left them. There was coffee on the stove. He poured her a cup without being asked and set it down in front of her. He said, "Write to Drummond. Tell him everything. Ask him what comes next." She looked at him. He met her eyes without expression, then picked up his own cup and looked out the window at the morning light on the pasture. She wrote the letter that afternoon. It was 4 pages long, and it held nothing back. The drought arrived in the way that serious droughts always arrived in that part of Texas, not suddenly but by degrees, each week a little drier than the last, the grass yellowing earlier than it should, the sky taking on that particular pale, washed-out quality that ranchers in the western counties had learned to read like a bad sentence. By June of 1885, the water in the main stock tanks had dropped to the level Elias had feared since February. By July, the drop had accelerated, and the cause was not hard to identify. Owen Gale's upstream diversion, the structure that had been quietly reducing the Brazos tributary flow for 7 years, had been run at full capacity since the first week of the dry season. Whoever was managing it had timed the increase perfectly, as if they had known the drought was coming and had made preparations. They had, of course. Men like the syndicate's directors understood dry weather patterns as well as any rancher. They simply had the additional advantage of not being the ones whose cattle needed water. What they did not know was that the Cutter Ranch's water situation had changed. The 3 wells on the eastern quarter were producing. The largest of the 3, the one Fortunato had located by reading the grass and the clay and the logic of the ground, was yielding more than 200 gallons per hour at a steady rate that showed no sign of dropping with the dry weather, because it was drawing from a shelf of water far below the level affected by surface conditions. The stock tank fed by the second well had been completed in late April and had filled to capacity by the end of May. Between the 3 sources, the Cutter Ranch had enough water to carry its herd through a summer that was shaping up to be one of the worst in recent memory. Elias said nothing about this publicly. He did not alter his purchasing patterns in ways that would signal anything. He rode the property on his usual schedule and maintained the same careful, contained expression he always wore. The ranch hands understood, without being told, that the water situation was not to be discussed outside the property. Fortunato had made this clear in the quiet, final way he communicated things that mattered. Meanwhile, the letter exchange with Percy Drummond in Austin had become a regular correspondence. Drummond was thorough, precise, and deeply invested in the case in a way that had stopped feeling professional and started feeling personal, though he never said as much directly. He confirmed that the State Land Commissioner's office had an ongoing, unofficial investigation into the survey practices of the Fort Worth Syndicate and had been building a file for 3 years. The problem had always been the same. They needed a plaintiff with enough documented standing to bring a formal complaint, and every rancher they had approached had been either already bought out, too frightened to proceed, or lacking the specific type of documentation that the case required. What the case required, Drummond explained in a letter dated the 15th of June, was a combination of 3 elements: a clear demonstration that the upstream diversion was operating in violation of the plaintiff's legally established water rights, a showing that the easement documents offered to the plaintiff had contained fraudulent misrepresentations about the applicable law, and evidence that these 2 actions were coordinated parts of a larger pattern affecting multiple properties. The first element was demonstrable from the 1876 survey and the visible condition of the tributary. The second element was what Marguerite had established with her annotated copy of Aldridge's document and the corroborating cases Drummond had found in the county records. The third element was what the Land Commissioner's file would provide. She worked on the documents through the summer evenings, sitting at the study desk with the lamp close and a growing stack of organized papers beside her. Elias occasionally came in, looked at what she was doing, and asked questions. The questions were good ones. He understood the structure of what they were building, and he had a memory for detail that proved useful more than once when she needed to reconstruct the precise sequence of events surrounding Aldridge's 2 visits to the ranch. He had not spoken further about what she had told him on the April evening. He had not raised it again, had not expressed anger about it, had not looked at her with anything she could clearly identify as accusation. What he had done, quietly and without announcement, was include her in every decision he made about the ranch and the case, as if her judgment were a resource he had always had access to and was simply now using more deliberately. She could not fully account for this, and she did not try to. She simply worked. In August, Drummond's letter contained a new piece of information. The state land commissioner, a man named Arthur Finch who had been in office since 1879 and had a documented record of ruling against syndicate-backed claims in 4 separate cases, was prepared to meet with Elias Cutter in person if Elias was willing to make the journey to Austin. Finch could not initiate action without a formal plaintiff. But if Elias agreed to be that plaintiff, Finch could bring the resources of his office to bear on the case in a way that transformed it from a single rancher's legal fight into a state-level enforcement action, which was a very different and considerably more powerful thing. Elias read that letter 3 times. He folded it and set it down and looked out the window at the dry August pasture, which was holding, just holding, because of 3 wells that would not have been dug without a woman who had come to the ranch for purposes that were now irrelevant. He said, "I will go to Austin in September." She said, "I will prepare everything you need to take with him." He nodded, then without looking at her he said, "You should come." She looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the way he was watching the land outside with the same focused attention he brought to everything. She said, "I did not think you would want me there." He said, "The documents are in your handwriting. Half of the analysis is yours. Finch will have questions I cannot answer without you." She said, "All right." He said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. She understood by then that this was how he moved through difficult things, not by discussing them at length but by deciding, simply, what the next necessary action was and taking it. What could not be acted on, he set aside. What could be, he addressed. It was, she thought, both his greatest strength and the thing that had cost him most over the years, because some things did not yield to action and required being sat with in their difficulty. But this was not the moment to say so. The preparations for the Austin meeting took 3 weeks. She organized the documents into 4 categories: the original water rights survey and its supporting evidence, the annotated easement documents with her legal cross-references, the correspondence with Drummond, selected and arranged chronologically, and a 4th section she compiled herself, a written account of the syndicate's actions as she had witnessed and understood them, from Aldridge's initial approach to her through the upstream diversion to the fraudulent survey language. This last document she wrote in plain, clear sentences without embellishment, the way her teachers had taught her to write testimony. State the fact, state the evidence for the fact, move on. Elias read the written account when she finished it. He read it through without stopping. When he had finished, he looked at her and said, "This is very good." She said, "It is accurate. Whether it is good depends on what Finch makes of it." Elias said, "It is both." They went to Austin on the 15th of September. The meeting with Arthur Finch lasted 4 hours. Finch was 60 years old, a compact and watchful man who asked precise questions and listened to the answers with complete attention. He spent the first hour going through the documents himself, making small marks in a notebook. He spent the second hour questioning Elias about the physical details of the water situation, the dates, the measurements, the observable changes in flow over 7 years. He spent most of the third hour talking to Marguerite. He asked her to walk him through her reading of the easement document and her identification of the fraudulent clause. She did so, slowly and thoroughly. He asked about the 2 comparable cases she had found in the county records. She described them, and where she had found the references, and how she had confirmed the connection to the same syndicate attorneys. He asked her how she had come to be in a position to analyze these documents, meaning what was her training and background. She answered honestly, a good education from strict teachers, many years of watching her father navigate complex business arrangements, and the specific circumstance of finding herself in a house where the relevant documents were available and the situation urgent. Finch looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he wrote something in his notebook, closed it, and said that he had what he needed to bring this to the commissioner's formal process. He said the case would take time. He said there would be difficulties, that the syndicate had resources and would use them. He said the outcome was not guaranteed, though the evidence was strong. He said all of this in a level, informational tone that reminded her, in a way she found unexpectedly comforting, of Elia's. He also said one other thing, at the door as they were leaving. He looked at the stack of documents Marguerite was carrying back to her bag and said that in 30 years of land law work, he had rarely seen a set of materials put together with this quality of precision and thoroughness. He said it in the particular way that a man says something he has thought about and decided to say, not as courtesy, but as honest assessment. She said thank you. He nodded and closed the door. On the road back, sitting in the coach with the Texas night moving past the windows, Elias said nothing for a long time. She had grown accustomed to his silences and had stopped trying to fill them. They rode through the dark, the coach swaying gently on the road, the lamp inside giving off a small, warm circle of light. After a while he said, "My father spent 15 years trying to protect that water. He never found a way in." She said he did not have the right documents. Elias said, "No, he did not." There was another silence. Then he said, "I want you to know that I understand what you did. All of it, including the part that was done against me and the part that was done for me. I am not a man who speaks easily about these things, but I want you to understand that I am aware of the difference." She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the dark land moving past. She said, "I know you are." He said, "Good." They did not speak again until they reached the hotel in the next town, where they stopped for the night. But the silence between them on that second stretch of road was different from the silences that had come before it, and she knew the difference, and she thought he did too. The legal case, when it formally began in the spring of 1886, was filed not as a single rancher's complaint, but as a state enforcement action supported by the testimony of 7 landowners in 4 counties, all of whom had been quietly contacted by Arthur Finch's office during the fall and winter of 1885. Of those 7, 5 agreed to participate formally. The other 2 were unwilling, for reasons of fear and financial exposure, and Finch respected that without comment. 5 was enough. The complaint described a pattern of coordinated action, fraudulent survey documentation, illegal upstream water diversion, and market manipulation intended to artificially depress land values in the western counties for the purpose of forced acquisition. It named Owen Gale, Preston Marsh, and Clifford Harlow by name as the operators of the illegal diversion. It named Gerald Aldridge as the legal architect of the fraudulent easement strategy. It named 3 officers of the Fort Worth syndicate as the principals directing the overall scheme. Elias was the lead plaintiff. His name appeared at the top of the document. He read the filing on a morning in March, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. He read the whole thing without expression, set it down, and said, "Good." Marguerite had expected some larger reaction. She had spent months building toward this moment, and had imagined, vaguely, that the arrival of the formal filing would feel like something definitive. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a longer and harder stage of work, which, she realized as she looked at the stack of preparation documents still on the study desk, was exactly what it was. Gerald Aldridge's response to the filing came indirectly, through a story that appeared in a Fort Worth newspaper 3 weeks after the complaint was filed. The story described the case and included, without naming its source, an account of how Marguerite had come to be on the ranch, including the detail that she had been recruited to assist in obtaining the Cutter Ranch's documents and had initially agreed to do so. The story did not say she had carried out the plan. It did not need to. The implication was clear enough. Elias read the newspaper account on a Thursday morning. He set it down on the table without comment. He did not look at Marguerite with any particular expression. He went out to work and came back in the evening and ate supper and asked her, as he usually did in the evenings, what correspondence had arrived and what it contained. She had expected him to say something about the newspaper account for days before she understood that he simply was not going to. It was not that he had forgotten or failed to understand its implications. It was that he had decided, with the same deliberate quiet that characterized every decision he made, that it was not a thing worth speaking about. It had happened, he had read it, he had assessed it, and he had returned to the work in front of him. The strategy behind the newspaper piece became clearer over the following weeks. Aldridge, or whoever had directed it, intended to use Marguerite's original arrangement as a way to complicate Elia's standing in the case. If she had come to the ranch under false pretenses, with the intent of assisting in document fraud, then the credibility of everything she had provided to Finch's investigation could be questioned. It was not a strong argument legally, because her actual actions, the annotated documents, the correspondence with Drummond, the testimony she had given, were what they were regardless of her original intentions. But it was an argument designed to be heard by a jury of West Texas men, and the syndicate's attorneys had presumably calculated that such men would be troubled by a woman who had come to a man's house in circumstances that were, by any charitable reading, irregular. This calculation turned out to be incorrect. The trial began in September 1886 in the county courthouse in Abilene, before Judge Walter Breen, whose record on cases of this type was exactly what Drummond had described. The gallery was full on the first day and remained full for most of the 2-week proceeding. The Western County ranching community had a keen interest in the outcome, for reasons that required no explanation. The syndicate's attorneys made their argument about Marguerite's background in the first week. They presented the outlines of Aldridge's arrangement with her, her initial agreement to it, and the original false pretenses under which she had arrived at the ranch. They argued that any document she had annotated or analysis she had provided was tainted by her prior agreement to assist in fraud against the man she now appeared to be supporting. Arthur Finch's counsel responded with a question that the syndicate's attorneys had not adequately prepared for. If the documents she had annotated were fraudulent, as the defense was now arguing, then who had created them? The annotated easement document was Aldridge's own document, produced by the syndicate's own legal operation. Marguerite's annotations had not created the fraudulent clauses. They had identified them. The attempt to discredit her work had the effect, unintended but unavoidable, of confirming the document's existence and drawing the jury's attention directly to the passages she had marked. The jury heard all of it. 12 West Texas men who owned land, raised cattle, and understood exactly what a water diversion did to a ranch over 7 years. They were not, as the syndicate's attorneys had assumed, troubled by the picture of a woman who had outmaneuvered a dishonest arrangement. If anything, the testimony about what she had found in those documents, delivered in plain and specific terms by Percy Drummond from the stand, produced an atmosphere in the courtroom that worked steadily against the defense. The diversion itself was the clearest evidence. Finch's team had employed a surveyor to document the upstream structure in detail, measuring its dimensions, its position relative to the original 1876 survey markers, and the precise degree to which it reduced downstream flow. The surveyor's testimony took an entire day and was, by all accounts, not exciting to listen to. But it established, with the kind of numerical specificity that could not be argued with, that Owen Gale had been operating an illegal structure on the tributary for at least 6 years, possibly longer, in direct violation of Elias Cutter's legally established water rights. Owen Gale's attorney argued that the diversion had been built in good faith, based on a survey interpretation that was genuinely disputed. Judge Breen listened to this argument with the patient expression of a man who had heard the same words, in various arrangements, for 30 years. He allowed it to be made in full. Then he asked the attorney to point to the specific survey document that supported the disputed interpretation. The attorney pointed to the 1879 survey addendum that the syndicate had commissioned. Breen read the relevant passage aloud. Then he read the corresponding passage from the 1876 original. He set both documents on the bench in front of him and looked at the jury. He said nothing. He did not need to. The verdict on the main count, that the upstream diversion was illegal and had operated in sustained violation of the plaintiff's water rights, was returned by the jury in 4 hours. The second count, confirming the fraudulent character of the easement documents, took an additional day of deliberation and came back in Finch's favor by a vote of 10-2. The third count, the one that named the syndicate officers directly, was the most complex and required the jury to work through a Saturday, which they did without complaint. All 3 counts were decided in favor of the plaintiff. Elias was sitting in the second row of the gallery when the verdict was read. His face showed nothing. Marguerite, sitting beside him, watched him from the side without turning her head. His hands were on his knees, perfectly still. When the last count was read and the courtroom began to produce noise around them, he turned to look at her briefly, and what she saw in his face in that single moment was not triumph or relief, but something quieter and harder to name, the look of a man who has been in a long and serious fight, and has, at last, simply stopped fighting. She reached over and put her hand on his. He turned his palm up and held it. The aftermath of the verdict was both less dramatic and more consequential than the trial itself. Owen Gale's financing from the syndicate evaporated within 6 weeks of the ruling. Without the backing that had sustained his operation through the expensive years of the diversion, his ranch entered a rapid financial decline. He sold the majority of his land within 18 months. Preston Marsh, whose operation had been more dependent on syndicate credit than his manner suggested, sold within the year. Clifford Harlow, who was a harder and more stubborn man than either of the others, attempted to restructure and hold on for 2 additional years before the bank that had replaced the syndicate's financing finally lost patience. Elias purchased the water rights to the full Brazos tributary access in the spring of 1888. The price was the one the syndicate had spent years trying to avoid paying him, established by the court as fair market value based on the unimpaired flow the diversion had been suppressing. He added 1,200 acres in the transaction. When the deed came through, he brought it home and put it in the deed box. Then he went out to look at the land. She found him at the eastern fence line, standing where the first well had been dug, looking across the pasture. The grass had come back strong that year, fed by a wetter spring and the full tributary flow that was reaching the property for the first time in almost a decade. The cattle in the far pasture were in better condition than any year she had seen. He said without turning, "My father would have liked this." She stood beside him. She said, "I think he would." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to use Harlow's eastern section for a new rotation block. I have been thinking about how to manage it with the existing fence lines." She said, "I have been thinking about the water agreements with the smaller operations. I want to talk to you about the arrangement I have in mind." He looked at her. She met his eyes. He said, "Tell me." And she did. What followed the legal victory was not a celebration. It was work, and it was the particular kind of work that requires a different set of skills than the fight that preceded it, the kind that asks not for confrontation or endurance but for vision, and the patience to build something that will outlast the person building it. Marguerite had been thinking about the water agreement since the previous winter. The idea had begun as a practical observation and grown, through months of quiet thinking, into something that felt to her like the shape of what the ranch could become if someone was willing to see it clearly. The situation she had observed was this: the smaller ranching operations to the south of the Cutter property, 6 of them within a reasonable distance, were each individually vulnerable to the same pressures that had threatened Elias for years. They lacked the resources to fight, individually, the kind of sustained legal and financial pressure that a well-backed syndicate could apply. They also lacked reliable water access, for varying reasons, the most common of which was that they had never had the capital to develop the kind of well infrastructure that might have freed them from dependence on tributary flow. They survived, most of them, season to season, managing a careful balance that left no room for error. What they needed, she thought, was not charity. It was a structured arrangement that gave them something they could not obtain alone in exchange for something the Cutter operation needed from them. The open-range era was ending. Everyone in the western counties could see it, even if most of them preferred not to say so directly. Barbed wire and railways, and the steady arrival of more settlers were changing the mathematics of cattle ranching in ways that made the old model, large herds on unfenced range, increasingly difficult to sustain. The ranches that would survive the next 20 years would be the ones that found a way to manage their land and water and health conditions cooperatively, sharing the costs of things that no single operation could carry alone. She brought the full version of the plan to Elias on an evening in October 1888, 3 months after the Harlow acquisition. She had written it out carefully. The terms she proposed for the water use agreements, the obligation on the lessees to maintain their fence lines and participate in a coordinated cattle health program, the financial structure that kept the Cutter ranch's water rights intact, while making them genuinely useful to operations that otherwise could not afford adequate water access, and the long-term benefit to the whole district of reducing the tick fever losses that had been costing every rancher in the county for years. Elias read it, he asked questions, she answered them. He read it a second time more slowly. He said, "The fence maintenance obligation is the part they will resist." She said, "Yes. But if they do not maintain their lines, the cattle health program cannot work, and if the program does not work, the tick fever losses continue and the whole arrangement fails. The obligation is not punitive, it is structural." He said, "You will need to explain that to them in those terms." She said, "I intend to." He said, "Some of them will not agree to the arrangement at all." She said, "Some will not. 3 or 4 of the 6 will be enough to demonstrate that it works. When the others see the results, they will ask to join." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You have already decided how to sequence this, which ones you approach first." She said, "Yes, Pete Hollies and Edmund Ward. They are the 2 most likely to see the logic of it immediately. If they agree, the others will be watching." Elias said, "Hollies has been suspicious of any arrangement involving Cutter land since the year before I arrived here. My father had a boundary dispute with his father that was never fully resolved." She said, "I know. I spoke with his wife at the church social in August. She is not carrying that dispute the way he is." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with what she recognized as the particular quality of his approval, which was never effusive but was unmistakable, "Talk to the wife first." She did. Clara Hollies was a direct and intelligent woman who understood the ranch's finances better than her husband acknowledged, and whose opinion, once formed, had a way of making itself heard. Marguerite visited her on a Tuesday in November, sat at her kitchen table, and explained the arrangement in plain terms, including the benefits and the obligations. Clara asked 4 questions, all of them practical and well-aimed. Marguerite answered each one without evasion. Clara said she would talk to Pete. Pete Hollies came to see Elias the following Saturday, The conversation took most of the morning. At the end of it, he agreed to review the formal terms. 3 weeks later, he signed. Edmund Ward required 2 visits and a significant modification to the fence maintenance clause before he signed, but he signed. By the spring of 1889, 4 of the 6 operations had joined the arrangement. The 5th came in the following autumn, after the first tick fever season under the Cooperative Health Program produced measurably lower losses than the previous 2 years, a difference that required no argument to convey, because the numbers were simply visible to anyone who could read a ledger. The 6th never signed. He sold his operation in 1891 to a buyer who, after 2 difficult seasons, approached Marguerite himself to discuss the arrangement. She negotiated the terms of his participation over 3 meetings and found him, in the end, to be a sensible man who had needed time to trust what he was looking at. The agreement he signed was the same agreement Pete Hollis had signed, with minor adjustments. He kept his land and his herd and worked within the cooperative system until he retired in 1903. The county agricultural office visited the Cutter operation for the first time in 1893, sent by a new state commissioner who was trying to understand why the tick fever numbers in that part of the county had diverged so sharply from the surrounding area. The inspector who came was a young man named George Whitmore who had studied at an agricultural college in the East and arrived with the faint air of a person expecting to explain things rather than to learn them. He spent 4 days on the property and the surrounding operations, looking at the fence maintenance records, the water agreements, the health program documentation, and the results in the cattle loss figures going back to 1889. He left without explaining anything. His report to the commissioner described what he had found as an unusually integrated range management system, a phrase that was both accurate and insufficient in the way that official descriptions of genuinely original things often are. What he had found, though his language did not quite reach it, was the application of a logic that did not come from agricultural college or cattle industry practice, but from a woman who had grown up watching her father manage trade relationships across 3 countries and had understood from early in her life that the real wealth in any system of exchange was not in the individual transaction, but in the network of relationships surrounding it. A trade route that one merchant controlled alone was always vulnerable. A network of routes that multiple merchants depended on, and therefore protected, was something else entirely. The ranch that Elias and Marguerite built in the decade after the legal victory was not the largest in Texas, by any measure that appeared in newspaper accounts or county tax records. What it was, by any honest accounting of its production and stability, and the quality of the land it maintained, was the most consistently productive cattle operation in its region for the following 20 years. It survived dry years that ruined operations 3 times its size. It adapted to the end of the open range without the financial crisis that took down dozens of larger ranches in the 1890s. It carried its herd through the tick fever outbreaks of 1894 and 1897, with losses so low that the Regional Cattle Association sent a representative to ask what they were doing differently. Marguerite sat down with that representative and explained it to him. All of it, the water infrastructure, the cooperative agreements, the fence maintenance obligation, the health program. She explained it in the same plain, specific language she had used in the documents she prepared for Arthur Finch a decade earlier, without embellishment, and without any effort to make it sound more complicated than it was. The representative, a capable man named Charles Greer who had been in the cattle business for 30 years, listened carefully and took thorough notes. He asked good questions. She answered them. At the end of the meeting, he said that what she was describing was essentially a form of coordinated land management that he had not seen applied in this way anywhere else in the western counties. He asked whether she had written it up formally anywhere. She said, not in a single document. Everything is in the original agreements and the operational records. He said someone should write it up. It would be useful to a good many people. She said perhaps someone will. She wrote it herself, over the winter of 1895, in a series of notebooks that she filled with careful, plain prose describing the structure and logic of what they had built. She wrote it not as a memoir but as a practical guide, the kind of document her father's trade contacts used to pass among themselves, full of specific terms and conditions, and the reasoning behind each one. She sent copies to Percy Drummond, who by then was in his late 60s and had largely retired from active practice, but still maintained a correspondence with anyone in the state doing interesting land work. She sent a copy to Arthur Finch, who had retired from the commissioner's office in 1892, but read it and wrote back with a letter that was 3 pages long and very warm. She sent a copy to Charles Greer at the Cattle Association. She kept one copy in the deed box, next to the original 1876 survey and the annotated easement document that had started everything. Elias died in June of 1901 from a heart condition that had announced itself quietly the previous autumn, and proceeded with the same methodical inevitability that he had always brought to difficult situations. He was 58 years old. He died in the room he had built when he was 24, with the windows open and the morning air coming in from the west. Marguerite sat with him through the last hours. Their daughter Catherine, who was 15, sat on the other side of the bed. Their younger daughter Nina was 12. Their son George, named for Elias' father, was 9. Elias said very little in those last hours. He was not a man who used words beyond what they were needed for. Near the end, he took Marguerite's hand and held it for a long time without speaking. The light in the room was the early morning light that came in low and turned everything the color of old honey. The same light she had seen when she walked up the track to this ranch for the first time in October of 1884 with her bag and her hidden arrangement, and no idea of who she was about to become. She held his hand until he was gone. The land passed in proper order by the terms of Elias' will to their 3 children jointly, with Marguerite retaining full management authority for as long as she wished to exercise it. She exercised it for 18 more years. The cooperative water agreements continued. The cattle operation expanded onto the Harlow acreage that had been added in 1888, and then onto 2 additional adjacent parcels acquired in the 1890s when their owners, facing the pressures of a changing industry, chose to sell to someone they trusted rather than to whoever made the highest offer. The trust had been built slowly, the way all real things are built, over years of keeping promises and doing what was said and making no claims that could not be demonstrated. Pete Holly's son, Samuel, eventually took over the Holly's operation and maintained the water agreement without renegotiation. He had grown up watching the arrangement work and had no interest in revisiting its terms. He was, according to everyone who worked with him, a straightforward and reliable man, which was widely attributed to his mother's influence. Edmund Ward's daughter, Lucy, inherited his operation and proved, over the following decade, to be the most capable and innovative rancher in the district by a considerable margin. She and Marguerite corresponded regularly until Marguerite's death, exchanging practical information about land management and water use with the comfortable directness of 2 people who understood they were working on the same problem from different positions. George Whitmore, the young inspector who had visited in 1893 and written the insufficient official report, came back in 1902 on his own time, no longer representing the commissioner's office, carrying a copy of Marguerite's notebooks that Charles Greer had lent him. He spent a week on the property, talking to everyone who would talk to him. He wrote a long article for an agricultural journal that was read by a small but seriously interested audience, and cited, in various forms, for the following 20 years by people trying to solve the same basic problem in different parts of the country. The photograph exists from the summer of 1897. A traveling photographer named Albert Hess came through the Abilene district that summer making a series of images of working ranches for a publication he was producing. He spent an afternoon at the Cutter property, photographing the buildings and the cattle and the people at their work. The image of Marguerite shows her standing at the fence line of the eastern pasture, the one with the 3 wells that she had proposed digging in the winter of 1884, and that had held water through every dry season since. She is wearing her working clothes. Her hair is pinned simply. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at something to the left of the frame, her eyes focused and attentive in the particular way that characterized everything she did, not at rest exactly, but steady. No one who was there that day recorded what she was looking at. The ranch hands who might have remembered were not asked, and by the time anyone thought to ask, the afternoon was 12 years gone, and the people in it scattered in the ways that time scatters things. She lived until March of 1919. She was 71 years old. She had spent 35 years on land that she had arrived at intending to help take from its owner, and had instead spent those years building something on it that lasted well beyond her, that held through the dry years and the hard seasons, and the changes in the industry that had ended so many other operations, that kept 7 families on their land who would otherwise have lost it, and that demonstrated, in the plain and specific terms she always preferred, what was possible when a person with the right kind of attention was allowed to work. The notebooks she wrote in the winter of 1895 are still in the deed box. So is the original 1876 survey. So is the annotated easement document, with her margin notes, in the careful and even handwriting that suggested someone who had learned to write from a strict teacher and never quite shook the habit of precision. The deed box is unlocked. It always was.